So I've got something special I'd like to show today. I've got this MiniMoog Model D from 1973. It's a distant relative to what we're used to by modern day standards. It's in beautiful condition and it sounds amazing. So I'm very happy to be able to give you a demonstration on this today. And usually I'm not a big fan of monophonic synthesizers, but these are an exception to the rule. They smell great, they sound great, they're great synthesizers, and it is part of the history. It's part of the legacy of analog synthesizers. If it wasn't for this thing, we probably wouldn't have polyphonic synthesizers. There's many different revisions. Some have finger sliders on them, some have CV gate, some have MIDI, some have this, that, and the other. But it's testament to the fact that these are revered highly and have been for 50 years. That's quite an achievement for Moog. So I'm going to give you a little tutorial on exactly what the knobs and switches do across the front panel. And if you're not into tutorials, then you can just skip straight to the noodle using the shortcut, which is in the description below. If you enjoy this clip, please like and subscribe and leave any comments or questions below. Let's just get straight to it. So starting from the right-hand side, we have our power switch and we have our output section. And we've got two different outputs. We've got our headphones output and a main output section. Now, that's quite unusual, but it was very handy for the MiniMoog because this little A440 switch here is actually your constant tone. So you can keep the Moog in tune because the MiniMoog was notorious for going out of tune. So to keep your oscillators in tune, you would actually manually have to tune them with the tune knob over here on the controller panel. With the constant tone. So if you switch on this A440, it gives you 440 Hertz, which is the key of A. So then you would tune your oscillators into the key of A. And then you could actually tune your other oscillators either to oscillator 1, or you could tune them again to the A440. And then oscillator 3. And that's how you would get your MiniMoog in tune. It's quite fascinating, really. It's how it used to be done. But the good thing is, if you were on stage playing live and your MiniMoog went out of tune, you could discreetly turn off your main output, plug your headphones in, and turn on your A440 tune switch, and then quietly get back in tune with the band or A440. So they're the features on the output section, which are quite handy, especially if you're on stage live and your MiniMoog goes out of tune. Now that we've established what the main output features are, we should probably now look at what these oscillators are, as we've just touched on those. So what we have here is we have three oscillators. The MiniMoog is monophonic. So the monophonic synthesizer means you can only play one note at a time. But you have three oscillators. You can actually consider your oscillators as different cheeses in a three-cheese cake or something like that, because each oscillator can be a slightly different flavor from each other, and then you can layer them all together. So if I play just an A and turn up the volume of oscillator 1, what we have is a range, an octave range. So we have very high, very low. And then we have oscillator 2. So if we turn down oscillator 1, we can turn up oscillator 2. And then we have oscillator 3. So if we turn up oscillator 3, turn down oscillator 2, And we have different types of oscillators, so different shapes. This is what I meant by cheese. If you think of them as different types of cheeses, you can kind of start to build different types of cakes. Now, if you turn up the volumes of all your oscillators on this little mixer section, you can actually turn them off with switches, or you can turn them down with volumes. Now, when all three of them are on, the MiniMoog starts really presenting its character. And you can actually slightly tune the oscillators against each other. Oscillator 1 is fixed to just the main tune, whereas the other two oscillators have got their own sort of fine-tune knobs. So that's how the oscillator section integrates with your output section, and how the mixer section controls the oscillator volumes. And we also have a couple of other little things here in this mixer section, like white noise or pink noise. So if we turn down, or turn off, I should say, oscillator 1, 2, and 3, and leave on the white noise, we just have straight up white noise, which is like a hiss, or we have pink noise. White noise is a little bit more consistent over the keybed or over the spectrum, where pink noise slowly sort of slopes off over the course of the spectrum. And then we have this external input, which is also interesting, and that external input is linked to this overload light here. Now, I'll show you what that does, because what you can do, and I think a lot of old sort of rock dogs and stuff used to do this a long time ago, they would grab the output from the headphones, connect it to the external input on the back, and then this external input volume would actually bleed in that signal. So like a guitar, you could actually get the Moog to feed back on itself. And let's just give that a little shot now. And we'll get rid of that white noise. We'll put on some oscillators. And now let's feed back the output of the headphones into the external input, and watch the overload light come on. Now you can hear that feeding back. Now, if I wanted to get some like a vibrato, most modern synthesizers have a modulation wheel. Now, what the interesting thing is about the MiniMoog is that by default it doesn't really have modulation. What you have to do is you have to burn one of your oscillators to imitate the speed of a modulator and then assign it to this. And it's automatically assigned by oscillator number 3. So this oscillator 3 control, if you turn your oscillator octave down to low, and then put the modulator in, you can hear that oscillator 3 is giving a ramp down shaped oscillator over to the cutoff frequency. And that's because the filter modulation switch is set to on. So if we turn that off, you won't get anything. If you turn the oscillator modulation on, now oscillator 3 will manipulate the other two oscillators with this mod wheel here. And we can change the shape of the oscillator that's being fed into the other two oscillators. And you can control the speed of that as well. Now you can probably hear that the speed of the shape is quicker up this end than it is down this end, and that's because oscillator 3, the keyboard control, is on. So if I switch that off, it's just now going to be consistent across the keyboard. So I've got oscillator 3 turned off, or I could turn it down. Now if I turn this on to sawtooth, now it behaves like most modern modulator wheels do on a modern synthesizer. So let's just try it. Now the feedback's kind of giving us a bit too much. And so this Minimoog has got a lot of character for an old dog. All right, so we'll take out the external input. Don't need that anymore. I've showed you what that is. So now if we look at the modifiers section, this is pretty much the section that most modern day synthesizers refer to as envelopes. And loudness contour is referred to more often than not as the amplifier envelope. And unlike most modern synthesizers, this Minimoog has attack, decay, and sustain, whereas most modern synthesizers have attack, decay, sustain, and release. But what they did on the Minimoog was that they had a switch, so you could switch the decay to act like a release, and that button's just here on the decay. So if you turn the decay on, the actual decay on this will just ring out, whereas if it's off, as soon as you take your finger off, it just cuts. So you can actually set this, then behaves exactly like a release knob would on a modern day synthesizer. And these little 1/4-inch jacks that they've got here, they're foot switches. So you can actually, if you were playing this live, you could actually have 2 foot switches beneath your feet on the ground, and so you could actually have decay happening almost like a sustain pedal, and then glide, which is quite interesting. Glide is controlled by this knob here, and that's the amount of time it takes to glide from one note to the next. So if I was to hold this and then drop all the way to the lowest to A, and then if I was to shorten the glide time and go back up to A, it doesn't take much time at all. Or if I was to flatten it out, it takes the longest amount of time that you can get to glide. So that glide is quite interesting. We have the pitch wheel, which is, there's no real frills on this particular pitch wheel. And then we have this modulation mix. So getting back to oscillator 3 as a modulator for the mod wheel, this modulation mix can switch oscillator 3 to the noise, and it just distorts everything. So you've obviously got 2 different types of noise. You've got your white noise or your pink noise. And so you can bleed that between oscillator 3 and white or pink noise. And that's your modulator section and your control section. So what we've got left with now is pretty much this little section up here, your filter section. So we've obviously got our cutoff frequency, our emphasis, which is what most keyboards refer to as resonance these days, and amount of contour. and most modern keyboards would actually call that envelope. What you can do is cutoff frequency is fairly self-explanatory, but for newbies, that's your brightness. Then emphasis is your resonance. And then amount of contour is how much your filter envelope will be actually factored in to the amount of cutoff frequency and resonance at the same time. So if there was a lot of attack, you can hear it rising up. If there's no attack, it just goes straight to decay and then off to sustain. The sustain level will hold the actual amount of filter and resonance to a particular position. So if I take the resonance out, shorten the decay, and then take out the envelope altogether, or amount of contour in this case, take out all the cutoff frequency, and now if I was to bleed in the amount of contour or envelope, it would actually just be pushing all of this in, despite the fact that the cutoff frequency is all the way down. So if I was to put loads of attack on that now, and then loads of decay, or no attack, no decay, just sustain. And you can also do the same, very similar with these particular knobs here, except obviously these ones here are the amplitude, not the actual filter style of envelopes. And then we have these little keyboard control sections. So this is like the brightness of bias across the keyboard from lowest to highest. So they're both set to high at the moment, so we'll turn them off. And so what that does is gives us a little bit of a frequency bias that heads towards the upper end of the keyboard. So without these two on, it's actually neutral. It's a neutral amount of frequency across the keyboard. So you've got one level of bias, two level of bias, or three level of bias. And then you've obviously got your filter modulation there, which is controlled by this. So we need some sustain on this. And if I was to turn up the speed of the modulator, so I can turn that off, turn the oscillator modulation off, and then that way it's just flat. Filter modulation, slow it all the way down, and then you can turn up the resonance. So that's a lot of the features explained for the Minimoog. There's a few jacks on the back. There's an S trigger, which is like a short trigger, which is a very old sort of incarnation of CV and gate. There's an external input that we've demonstrated. There's the high and low volume main output. It's not stereo, it's mono. And then there's an oscillator input, which apparently you can send in your own oscillator shape. And I haven't experimented with that yet because I'm not too sure what the voltage is or anything. So I'd have to look into that a bit more. So now that I've given you a little run through of all the parameters on the front panel of the Minimoog, I'm going to do a little demo of what sort of sounds we can actually pull out of this. So if you've enjoyed the walkthrough so far, feel free to like, subscribe, and leave some questions or comments in the comment area. And stay tuned for more demos coming soon.